The wedding ring came south in a locked box before ever the bridegroom's face did, and Frances Wren understood, watching her aunt turn it to the candle to judge the weight of the gold, that no one in the warm, bright drawing room had thought to ask whether she was willing to go. It lay in its bed of blue velvet on the table, a plain broad band of old northern gold. Sent down a week's travel by a man who had never seen her, and every eye in the room was on it, on the settlement beside it, on the ducal seal at the foot of the deed like a great red coin. And not one of those eyes was on her, though it was her own name the clerk had engrossed in the blank where the bride went, Frances Wren, spinster, of no fortune, 23 years old and worth. To the family that housed her, exactly the price of her keep, and not a shilling more. She had known for 3 days that it would be her. There was no one else it could be. Her Aunt Ferris had no daughters to spare, and no wish to spare them if she had. And Frances, the orphaned niece taken in for charity and kept for use, the plain one, the quiet one, the one who read, was the single unpromised, unwanted article in the whole prosperous house. A duke who asked for a wife sight unseen and offered a settlement to make a merchant weep was not a thing Augusta Ferris meant to let past her door for want of a girl nobody else was using. For that was the whole of the strange bargain, and the county had it by heart within the day. The Duke of Wraxholm, whom no one in 3 shires had seen above the length of his own park in a dozen years, had let it be known, through his man of business, that he wished at last to marry, and would do it in the one manner a man may who cannot bear to be looked at, entirely by article and sight unseen, choosing no face because he could not offer his own to be chosen, settling a fortune upon whatever gentlewoman would be sent north to him, and asking in return only that she come. He would not court. He had carried his marked face out into the world exactly once, the county said, 20 years before, and been refused before the whole of it, and he did not mean to carry it out again. Augusta Ferris had read the offer twice, glanced once at the fire, and once at her niece mending the household linen in the window-seat, and had known her own mind before the tea was cold. "It is a great chance, Frances," she said, in the voice she used for matters already settled, "a greater chance than a girl in your position has any right to look for. And I will not have you spoil it with a long face. A duchess, only think. Whatever they say of the man, a coronet covers a great deal, and gold covers the rest. You will thank me for this one day. I dare say I shall thank you for a great many things one day, Aunt, when I have the leisure to reckon them together," said Frances, not looking up from her needle. "May I see the settlement?" There was the small silence that always fell when Frances said a thing that did not fit the girl they had all agreed she was. Mr. Cardo, the Duke's solicitor, a spare, dry, exact man of 60, who had come south with the box and the deed, and a face that gave away nothing, looked at her across the candle, with an attention she felt on her cheek like a draught. Her aunt laughed. "See the settlement. What can you want with it, girl? You have only to sign where the good man shows you." "Then it will cost the good man nothing to let me read it first," said Frances, and put out her hand. She read the whole of it by the one candle, every folded skin, while her aunt fidgeted and Mr. Cardew sat very still, because she had decided that a woman who signs a paper she has not read has agreed in advance to whatever the cleverer party across the table pleases. She found what she had expected, and it frightened her a little by its size, a settlement so large it could only have been set down by a man who wished the thing done and had no one at his elbow to make him drive a harder bargain. And she found, folded at the back, a clause left blank, a place the Duke's man had been told to fill with whatever the lady asked, and had left open because no lady had yet been consulted at all. She sat a moment with her finger on the blank clause, then folded the deed along its creases and looked up. "There are 2 things wanting, Mr. Cardew, and then I shall sign." "Name them, Miss Wren," said Cardew, and there was something in the dryness of it that was almost approval. The first is my own, and I will be plain, for I have watched what becomes of money in this house that is not nailed down. My maintenance is to be settled to my sole and separate use, not my aunt's, not my uncle's, not to be reached by any creditor of any fairest living or unborn. I do not say it to be disobliging, aunt. I say it because I have kept your accounts 4 years, and know to a shilling how money travels in this family, and I do not intend to travel with it. Her aunt made a sound. Mr. Cardew inclined his head and wrote. The second is not money at all, and it is the one I care for. My father was Mr. Thomas Wren. You will not have heard of him. He grew things. Camellias, chiefly. He had a little fame for them once, 40 years ago, and no fortune ever. Because a man who loves a living thing more than a guinea does not die rich. He died last spring, and everything he had is to be sold up on Thursday to pay what he owed. His garden, his glasshouse, his books, his whole life's collection of plants, which my aunt considers so much rubbish, and which is the only thing in the world I have ever wanted to keep. That is my clause, Mr. Cardew. Before I sign a word, my father's collection is to be bought in entire on Thursday morning. Every pot, every book, every cutting, before the hammer falls, and carried north with me, unbroken. I will be a duchess sight unseen for a man I have never met. That is a small enough thing to ask, and it is all I shall ever ask. His Grace may keep his coronet and his gold. I will have my father's plants. The room was quiet. Her aunt looked at her as though the linen had risen up, and made terms. And Mr. Cardew took off his spectacles, polished them, put them on again, and looked at her a long moment with the plain gold ring lying between them in the light. His Grace instructed me that whatever the lady asked, within reason and the law, I was to grant, and gladly, and trouble him with none of it. This I can grant, Miss Wren, and it will be done before the sale opens. I will send a man to Thursday's auction myself, and I will tell you plainly that in a long life of this work I have never once heard the party being married ask first, and only after a dead man's flowers. His Grace will find it of interest. His Grace, I think, will find it of very great interest indeed. His Grace may find it whatever he pleases, said Francis. It is late, and I have been married before supper to a man I would not know if he walked through that door. Draw the clause, and buy in my father's garden, and I will sign your master's settlement, and go to his house, and see for myself whether the county has ever told me the truth about anything at all, for it has been wrong about me the whole of my life, and I begin to wonder what else it has decided it knows, and never once troubled to go and look at. She signed on the Tuesday, and on the following Monday she went north to Wraxholm, in a carriage the Duke had sent, with her father's worn plant notebook in her lap, and, wrapped in flannel in a box beneath the seat, the last living cutting of the last of his camellias. Struck by her own hand the week he died, carried a week's cold journey to a house she had been told all her life was the coldest in England. Wraxholm Hall stood at the far cold end of the north, past the last market town, up a long climbing road between fells gone white and silent, at the head of a black water the country people called the Mere. Frances had heard of the house all her life the way one hears of houses in the darker sort of stories shut, they said, the great rooms under Holland. No company these dozen years, no music, no light in the long front after dark. And they said, the ostlers at the last change had said it, not knowing who she was, that at the frozen heart of Wraxholm stood a great glasshouse, the old Duchess's famous winter garden, that the beast kept locked and lightless and let freeze, a crystal palace of dead things under the glass, and that no living thing grew at Wraxholm now, nor ever would while he was master of it. She sat back with her father's notebook under her hands and told her heart, as one tells a nervous horse on a bridge in the dark, to walk on and mind its feet. The Duke had not come out. A man does not stand on his steps in the snow to be looked at by the wife his lawyer has fetched. It was the housekeeper who met her under the great porch as the last light went blue on the fells. A spare, upright, iron-gray woman of 60, with a ring of keys at her waist, and a face that had long ago given up the habit of showing anything, who curtsied and said, "Your Grace." "I am Mrs. Halsted. The house is glad of you," in a voice that made it impossible to tell whether the house was anything of the kind. "Thank you, Mrs. Halsted," said Francis, getting down stiff and cold and steady into the enemy's hall. "I have had a week to imagine what a house getting a plain nobody for its duchess must think of the business, and I will save it the trouble of pretending otherwise. It is all quite true. I am plain, and a nobody, and was got here cheap, and none of it signifies to the keeping of a house, which is the only thing I am useful at. I do not faint, and I am not afraid of this house, whatever it has decided to be. Might we begin with where I am to sleep? I have been 6 days in a carriage, and I should like to be of some use by morning." Something moved, very far back, in the iron of the housekeeper's face. Francis would learn, months on, that it was the moment Mrs. Halsted went down and quietly stopped the below-stairs wager on how many nights the new duchess would last, and the woman said, "This way, Your Grace," took up a branch of candles, and led her in. The rooms they had given her were in the south front, and they stopped her on the threshold, not because they were grand, though they were, but because they were warm. Fires burned in both grates, banked and screened close behind brass guards, so that not a spark could travel. The bed was aired, the sheets warm, the rooms made ready by someone who had thought about the cold she would be coming out of. And on the little table by the window, squared exactly to the edge, stood a single thing that stopped her breath. It was a small camellia, in a plain earthen pot, and it was in flower. One perfect flame-red bloom, and 3 more in bud glossy dark leaves, a living plant in full winter flower in the dead heart of January, in the coldest house in England, waiting on her table as though the season had been told to stand aside. Frances set down her father's notebook very carefully, because her hands had begun without her leave to shake, and stood looking at the impossible red flower in the candlelight, in the house of the man said to let every living thing under his roof freeze, and did not understand one word of what she saw. Mrs. Halsted, this plant. Where did it come from? His Grace, madam. His Grace grows camellias. It could not be a question, it was too large. I'm sure I couldn't say what His Grace grows, madam, said Mrs. Halsted, whose composed face said plainly that she could say and would not, and she set down the candles and went to the door. And there she paused, and did a thing that cost her visibly a great deal, which was to say one word more than her office required. "It flowers in the cold." "That one, madam," she said, not turning round, "when everything else has given up. That is the whole trick of it. I have always thought it a great pity more people don't know that about it." And she went out, and left the new Duchess of Wraxholm alone in the warm, lighted room, looking at a red flower blooming out of season in her enemy's house, listening to her own heart, which she had told to walk on, and which now stopped dead in the road until it had been told what in the name of heaven was happening here. They were married 2 days later, quietly, in the cold little chapel of the hall, before almost nobody. Mrs. Halsted, Mrs. Cardew come north for it, and an old parson named Mr. Loder, who had christened the Duke, and plainly meant to keep up the family habit of weeping in that chapel while he did it. Frances wore her grey silk and no veil. She had resolved on the 6 days of the road on the one thing she had to give, which was honesty, because she would not begin a marriage in a lie, and because whatever the county said of him he had bought in a dead stranger's flowers on the strength of one sentence, and a man who did that was owed the truth from the woman he had done it for. The Duke came in at the last, out of a side door, and stood beside her at the rail, and for the first time in her life Frances Wren stood close enough to the beast of Wraxholm to see what the whole North had been so busy about for 20 years. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, dark, near 40, and along the left side of his jaw and up toward the temple ran an old scar, long-healed, not the raw horror of the fireside tales, but a pale tout seam in a grave and rather handsome face, the kind of mark one saw and then, oddly, a moment later half stopped seeing. His right hand was gloved, though the left was bare, and he held the gloved one a little back and a little turned, with the habit of a man who had spent 20 years managing what people were permitted to see of him. His eyes, when they came to her at last, were a dark gray and very steady, and held the braced stillness of a man waiting to watch a face change. "Miss Wren," he said, low, before the parson began. His voice was rough and quiet, like a wheel going slow over gravel. "You have come a very long way to a very cold house, for a man you have never seen, on my lawyer's word alone. I do not know how to begin to apologize to you for it." "You need not begin, your grace, for I did not come to be apologized to," said Frances. "I came because I had no fortune and no future, and years of being useful to people who did not thank me for it. And you offered me, sight unseen, a fairer bargain than any man who had seen me was likely to offer, and because you did one thing no one in my life has ever done, buy in a foolish dead man's flowers because a stranger asked you to, and trouble your lawyer for none of it. So I will not lie to you at an altar. I know what the county says of you. I do not believe I know one true thing about you yet, and I am not fool enough to pretend I do. I have come to keep the bargain I signed, and I will keep it faithfully. But I will not tell you I feel what I do not yet feel, and I will not flinch from your face to be polite, and I will not pretend, ever, to be a more comfortable wife than the honest one you have got. You would find me out inside a week, and think the less of me, and be right to." She had braced, without knowing it, for coldness. A man so long alone learns coldness the way other men learn a trade. What she got instead undid her more than any coldness could have. The Duke looked at the plain, steady young woman who had not once, in the whole of that speech, dropped her eyes from his marked face, and something crossed the scarred grave features that she had no name for then, though she would have a name for it later, and the name would be Hope, badly out of practice. "No," he said, so quietly that only she could hear it. "Do not pretend, and do not flinch, and above all do not feel what you do not feel. I would not have it for the world. Of everyone who has ever come into this house, Miss Wren, you are the first to walk into it looking at me instead of past me. But I would rather be married by a woman who tells me she does not yet know me, and looks me in the face while she says it, than by any beauty in England who smiled at me and would not." And he turned to old Mr. Loder and said, "Begin, if you please," and married her. There was no wedding peal, and no company, and no feast. The marriage was made in a silence so complete she could hear the winter wind at the chapel windows, and the small settling of the coals in the vestry grate. When it was done he bowed over her hand, the bare left one. He did not offer her the glove, and said he hoped she would find the house not so cold as she had been told, and was gone, out of the side door he had come in by, back into the far shut end of the great house, before she had rightly understood she was a duchess. She dined alone that first night, at one end of a table that could have seated 40, in a silence so deep she could hear the wine come into the glass. His Grace, the old butler Pardoe, told her with an apology almost painful, begged to be excused. His Grace kept to himself of an evening. She dined alone the second night, and the third. She was not offended. She had gathered enough to know it was not rudeness, but a locked door with a man behind it who had half forgotten there was a key. The whole vast cold house was arranged, she came to see, around a single absence. A man at the far dark end of it who had decided, long ago, that the kindest thing he could do the world was to be neither seen nor heard in it. And he meant plainly to go on giving and asking nothing, at the far dark end of the house, for the whole of their 2 lives. Frances bore it for 3 dinners. On the 4th morning, having established from Mrs. Halstead that his Grace was to be found most mornings in the one place at Wraxholm, no servant went unbidden. She put on her warmest shawl and her stoutest boots, and went to find her husband where he lived. Which was to say, she went to the great glass house. The whole county swore was full of nothing but the dead. She found it down a long covered walk at the back of the house, a walk that grew strangely warmer as she went, so that by the last turn she had loosened her shawl without noticing, and then she came through a plain door into the winter garden of Wraxholm, and stood, and forgot, for a long minute, everything she had ever been told. It was summer. Behind the glass, in the dead white heart of a northern January, it was high green summer. A great vaulted hall of iron and glass rose 2 stories over her head, every pane bright with the hard white light off the snow, and under it grew such a green living richness as she had not seen since the last good June of her father's life, orange trees heavy with dark leaves and ripening fruit. A wall of camellias 20 feet high in full flower, myrtle and jasmine and things she knew the Latin of, and things she had only read of, ranked and banked and climbing, warm, watered, cared for, alive, every leaf of it alive, in a house the whole world outside believed kept nothing but the dead. Great iron stoves burned at the corners, feeding warmth up through pipes into the winter-defying green, and Frances Wren, who had been 6 days cold and 3 days lonely and 23 years unwanted, stood in the doorway of the coldest house in England in the middle of a garden that had refused to die, and felt the tears come up hot and sudden for the first time since her father was put in the ground. Then she saw him, far down the green length of it, in his shirt sleeves, both hands bare, the gloved one bare now, and she saw the old drawn shining scarring across the back of it, and looked, and did not look away. The Duke of Wraxholm stood at a potting bench, with his dark head bent over a tray of cuttings, doing with his own scarred hands the small patient work of keeping a thing alive. A man entirely alone with the one living thing he had, who had not yet heard her come in. She must have made some sound, for he turned, and she watched him go, in a breath, from a man at ease in his own green world to the braced creature of the chapel rail, watched him snatch for the glove on the bench, and then stop himself, half caught, the scarred hand exposed between them. "Madam," he said rough, turning his marked side by instinct toward the doorpost. "You should not. The servants do not come here. Is something wanting? You have only to tell Mrs. Halstead. Nothing is wanting, your Grace. That is rather the difficulty." She came in, and let the warm green air close over her, and did not stare at the scarred hand, and did not look away from it, but only looked about her at the green vaulted miracle of the place, as though she had every right to be there. "I have been 3 days being wanted nothing of, and it does not agree with me. I was not raised to be an ornament, as my family took some pains to remind me. And I have just walked into the thing the whole county told me was a tomb, and found it the most alive place I have stood in since my father died. You keep a June garden through a northern winter, alone, with your own hands, and let the world believe you keep a graveyard. Why?" He looked at her a long moment down the green aisle. "Because a garden everyone believes is dead is a garden no one asks to see, and a thing no one asks to see may be kept exactly as one wishes, and loved exactly as much as one likes, without anybody coming to look at it and find it wanting." He set the bare, scarred hand flat on the bench, deliberately, as though making himself leave it in the light. I had not expected the woman I married to walk in here at all, still less to tell me it is alive. Everyone else who comes to that door tells me it must be very sad to sit among so many things that will not grow. Then everyone else who comes to that door cannot tell a living plant from a dead one, which I have been able to do since I was 5 years old, and is the single accomplishment I have. That is a Camellia japonica in flower, not a monument. The myrtle wants pinching back, and one of your orange trees in the far tub is being quietly murdered by scale no one has troubled to turn a leaf over and look at, which I can have off it in an afternoon, if you will let me be of use, for I shall go quietly out of my mind in that pretty room otherwise. My father grew these things. I potted a camellia before I could properly read. Give me the scale to fight and the myrtle to prune, and I will not talk while I do it. Only do not send me back to be an ornament, for I make a very poor one." He looked at her, and at the green ranks of his impossible summer, and at the bare scarred hand he had made himself leave upon the bench. And something at the grave corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, as though remembering the use of a muscle it had almost forgotten it owned. He crossed the aisle, found a soft cloth and a second stool, and set the stool. She saw him do it, without seeming to know he did it. A little nearer the warmth of the nearest stove, on the sheltered side, before he said, "The scale is on 3 of them, not 1. Sit then, if you will not be sent away. God knows it wants a second pair of hands that know one leaf from another. I have kept it alone so long I no longer see it." And that was how the marriage of purchase between the beast of Wraxholm and his sight-unseen bride began, leaf by leaf, in the warm green heart of the house the whole world believed was cold, to become something that had never been in anybody's bargain. She learned the house through its garden, and the man through the house, and it was on the 5th such morning, working the great south wall where the oldest and tallest of the camellias grew, that she came upon the thing that stopped her heart a second time in that house. For tied to the main stem of the greatest and most venerable of them all, an ancient plant grown near to the glass roof, was a little wooden label, gone brown and soft with the warm wet years, and on it, in a faded copper plate she would have known blindfold at the bottom of the sea, was written a name. And the name was T. Wren. She stood very still with her hand on the old stem. "Your Grace, this old camellia against the wall. Where did it come from?" He looked up and saw where her hand was, and something careful came into his face. "That is the oldest thing in this house that is alive," he said. "Older than I am. It was my mother's, the first she ever had, and always her favorite. She used to say the whole garden grew up around it. It came to her from the man who bred it, before I was born, one particular grower, a gentleman in the South with more genius for the work than sense for his own affairs. She corresponded with him 30 years. I never met him. I only kept his plants alive because they were hers." He stopped. He had seen her face. "Madam, you have gone white. What is it?" "His name," said Frances, and her voice was not quite her own. "The man who bred it. His name was Wren, was it not?" "Thomas Wren." The silence in the greenhouse was very complete. "Yes," said the Duke of Wraxholm. "Thomas Wren. It is on all the old labels, in his own hand. How do you—" And then she watched him arrive at it, watched it go through him like light through the glass. "You are Frances Wren. I asked for a gentlewoman, and troubled myself with nothing else, God forgive me, and my lawyer sent me his daughter. The flowers I bought in on Thursday because a stranger's clause asked me to. That was his garden. His whole life's collection you would not leave to the hammer, downstairs now in my own coach-house, and your father is the man who gave my mother the only thing in this house I have kept alive for 20 years. Because I could not bear to let the last of her go cold." Frances sat down rather suddenly on the stool near the stove, and put her hand over her mouth, and found she was weeping, silently, in the warm green light, for her ruined gentle father, who had died believing his life's work so much lumber, and who had, it turned out, 40 years before, sent north to a great cold house a plant that a lonely scarred boy would grow up to keep alive out of love for. His dead mother, alone, through 20 winters, in a house the whole world called a tomb. And the Duke of Wraxholm, who knew no more what to do with a weeping woman than with a wife who looked him in the face, came and stood near her, not touching, and said the truest thing either had yet said in that marriage. Then we have neither of us been so alone in this as we thought. His flowers, kept warm at both ends of the country, by two people, who never knew the other was doing it. I am glad you came, Francis Wren. I did not expect to be able to say that to anybody ever again, and I find I can say it to you. I am glad you came. She learned the rest of the man more slowly, through that spring, and it was old Truscott who taught her most of it. The bent brown-head gardener of near 70, who had tended the winter garden since before the Duke was born, and kept the stoves burning through 20 winters at his side, and who took to appearing wherever she was with some errand to excuse him, letting fall, sidelong, the parts of her husband's history the county's tale left out, that his Grace had been a warm, laughing, open boy once, a second son with no weight on him, until the winter it all changed, that the title had come sideways and unlooked for, an elder brother gone before him and his father not long after, and that there had been a young lady, before, here old Truscott grew careful, the most beautiful in 3 counties, a Miss Celestine, as good as promised to the young lord while he was whole and merry, who found she could not care for him after, and married elsewhere, and was my Lady Rossiter now. But it was not the accident, Truscott said, low, and not the lady's going either, that had put the Duke into the far wing like a man serving out a sentence. It was the thing underneath both, the thing he had carried alone since he was a young man, and never told a living soul, the thing a body would have to be told by the Duke himself, or never know at all. And who? Said Francis quietly, pinching out the myrtle with steady fingers, not looking at the old man. Do you think in 20 years his Grace might ever come to trust so far as that? Old Truscott looked at her a long while, at the plain, steady face, at the sure hands among the leaves. I've an old man's notion, madam, if you'll pardon it. Every soul that ever came to that glass-house door stood in it and told him how sad it must be to keep a garden nobody sees. You're the first in 20 years to walk in and tell him it's alive. He could never abide the ones that pitied him, too cheap, pity, and had always wanted paying back in gratitude he hadn't got. But a woman that walked into what she'd been told was his tomb, and looked round it, and told him he'd grown a summer, the old voice cracked, and he bent hard over his harness. Don't you let him carry it alone, madam, when he goes to tell you, whatever it is. He's been alone in it since he was a lad, and it's bent a straighter back than yours or mine would bear. Whatever's shut in him, it's shut the way that flower shuts against the frost. It only wants the right warmth to open. That's the whole trick of it. Frances did not force the shut thing. She had told him at the altar she would not pretend, and she could wait for a truth better than she could pry one loose. But she learned there was a covered press in the book-room, that Mrs. Halstead's ring did not open, and that there was one walk her husband would not take, and would not let her take, down to the near edge of the great mere, where the ice lay black and thick all that long winter. And when she once asked whether they might not walk down to the water, the only time in all those weeks the quiet, rough voice went flat and hard, he said, "You will not go down to the mere, Frances. I ask you one thing in this house, and it is that. The garden is yours, and the house, and every key on Mrs. Halstead's ring, but the one that opens nothing you need to open. But not the mere. Not in winter. Give me that, without my telling you why, and one day I will tell you why. I will give it you, and gladly, and without understanding it," she said. because you have kept my father's flowers alive 20 years, and set his last camellia on my table before you knew whose it was. But I will tell you plainly, since we began honest, a locked door in a marriage is a lodger who pays no rent. And sooner or later, one of the two people feeding it grows tired. When you are ready to open that door, I will be standing at it, and I would far rather have whatever is behind it from your own mouth, by daylight, than come upon it myself in the dark, which, having married the woman who reads, you should know I am uncommonly likely to do. He did not answer her then. But that night, for the first time, the Duke of Wraxholm came down to dinner. He came late and stiffly, like a man wading into cold water to the chest, and took the great chair at the head of the long table, with his marked cheek turned from the candles, and he wore the glove, the scarred hand hidden in dark leather among the silver, for the lighted table was still the old cold world where he armored himself. She said nothing of the glove, and passed him the salt as though they had dined together 30 years. I have had Pardoe lay my place at your right hand, on my own authority, so if it is wrong you may blame me and not him. And I have a quarrel to pick with you about the far stove, which is scorching the jasmine, and which no one has looked at because everyone at Wraxholm is far too frightened of you to tell you your own stove is faulty. I am not frightened of you, so I shall tell you. He had turned, without seeming to notice, so that the marked side of his face was full to the candles and full to her, and she made herself neither stare at the scar nor look away, but only look at him. Have it drawn and cleaned, he said, and report to me. No one has told me a fault in this house in 20 years. Francis, the whole household has arranged itself around the notion that I am a man who must not be troubled, and it is a very lonely way to be cared for. Tell me faults, I would rather have the faults than the quiet. And so, dinner by dinner, the long silence of Wraxholm began to fill with talk, low and dry and particular, of the garden and the estate, and then of books. For he had been a great reader before it all, and had let it lapse the way he had let lapse everything that gave him joy. And he listened to her as no living soul had ever troubled to, and evening by evening she came to the slow upending understanding that the thing at the head of the table was not a monster, and never had been, but the shyest and most careful man she had ever known, wearing the most feared face in the North, because the North had given it to him, and he had not had the heart, nor the hope, to give it back. The face itself she grew used to so fast it shamed her. That was the secret no one told you about a scar, that it shouts for a week and then it is only a face. But the glove she did not grow used to, because she came to understand the glove was not the face. The glove was the wound, the face was only the sign of. He wore it always where he might be seen, and took it off only in the garden, where nothing living had ever flinched from his hand. She unfroze the house by degrees that spring, because she could not help it, and because she had begun, without ever deciding to love him, opened the shrouded rooms, let light into the long front, brought the sound of a living household back into a place that had kept the silence of a shut drawer for a dozen years. And one bright cold evening in the glasshouse, working late among the camellias with the snow blue at the panes, she straightened from the bench to find him standing close behind her, having come up the aisle without her hearing, and then the gloved right hand, the hidden one, the one he managed everything not to use, came up, very slowly, as though doing a thing it was not sure it was allowed, and rested on her shoulder, and after a moment with the other hand he drew the glove off it, there in the warm green light, and let the bare scarred hand lie against the gray silk of her shoulder unhidden, for her, and he said, in a voice she had not heard him use, low and rough and unsteady, "Francis, only that." her name by itself, as the whole of the sentence and not the direction on the front of it, the first time in her life anyone had said her name as though it were the point of everything and not the label of a useful girl, and she stood very still and did not turn round, because she would not have him ever think she wept for pity. It was at the very tail of the winter, in the last hard freeze of it, that the mere gave up its secret, and the man with it. There came a black night when the thaw had begun by day and set again hard by night, the ice on the great mere gone rotten and grey under a skin of new frost, and across it, coming home late by the old short way over the water that the country people had used 100 years. A young farming couple of the estate, Tom Ockley and his wife, went through the ice into the black water within 100 yards of the near bank, and their cries came up to the house on the still cold air. Frances woke to shouting, and to a light moving on the water, and to the sound of a man's boots going down the stairs 3 at a time, and the great door flung wide, and a horse brought round at the gallop, and she was at the window in time to see. By the light of the lanterns already running down from the village, her husband ride down toward the mere he had forbidden her, bareheaded, in his shirt, the scarred hand bare on the reins, straight toward the black water he had not gone near in 20 years. She followed. She flung on a cloak, and had the old cob saddled and rode down into the freezing dark behind him, and what she saw on the edge of the mere she carried the rest of her life. She saw the white edge of the water lit with lanterns, and the villagers gathered helpless on the safe bank, none daring the rotten ice, and 2 dark shapes far out where the black hole gaped, and she saw the beast of Wraxholm, the monster of 20 years of firelit winter stories, go off his horse at the run, and out onto the groaning grey ice, on his own 2 feet, without a half-second's pause, spread flat and crawling where it cracked, a rope round him that shamed willing hands paid out from the bank, going out over the very place the whole county said had frozen his heart, toward 2 of his own people in the water. He reached the man first and got the rope to him, and the bank hauled him in. Then he went further, to the edge of the black hole itself, where the woman had gone under and come up, and was going down again, and got his bare scarred hand into her collar as the ice broke wholly under them both, and held her up until the men on the rope, ashamed now into a courage they had not owned a minute before, dragged the 2 of them bodily back across the breaking ice to the frozen shore. They got them all in, alive, the Ockleys living, and the Duke half perished, his lips gone grey, the old scarred hand cut fresh on the knife edge of the broken ice and bleeding into the snow. And Frances, running to him where they laid him on the bank, got her arm under his head, and heard the whole white shore fall into a silence quite unlike any she had met at Wraxholm, the silence of 20 people watching the monster they had been raised on lie grey and shuddering in the snow with his hand cut open. Having gone out onto ice, not one of them had dared to bring 2 of their own out of the black water, and understanding, altogether, slowly, in the swinging lantern light, that they had been telling the wrong story about this man for as long as most of them had been alive. She got him home, and would let no one else touch him. She had him carried to her own warm shielded room, and stripped of the frozen shirt and wrapped and warmed, and the cut hand washed clean by her own hands, the fresh hurt over all the old ones, and it was there, deep in the cold small hours, with his scarred hand bandaged in her lap, and the one lamp she would let burn standing steady between them, that the Duke of Wraxholm told his wife the truth. Because a man who has just watched a woman ride down alone in the dark to a frozen mere after him cannot, it turns out, keep a locked door between them by so much as a silence. "You have wondered about the mere," he said, looking at the black window, "and about the door in the book-room, and the lady the county says could not love my face. So I will tell you, and then you may think of me what you must, and I will say no word against it." He drew a breath that shook, not with cold now. "The county says I got this face and this hand in a wildness of my own. that I drove like a madman on the ice one winter night in a jealousy, and wrecked us and marked myself, and that Celestine took one look at what I had made of myself and could not love me after, and fled, and married better, poor beautiful creature, and who could blame her? It is a lie from the first syllable. I was not driving. She was. He made himself go on, the flat, careful voice of a man reading out a thing long engraved. We were as good as betrothed that winter. The whole country thought it settled, and so did I. God help the boy I was. But she did not want me, not truly, not even then, whole and merry and rich as I was. She wanted a match with more dash in it. A soldier she had met that autumn, and had settled it in secret to run off with him that very night, over the mere to where his chaise waited on the far side. And she took my sleigh and my fast grey team to do it, and someone carried me word that she had gone out onto the ice at dark, and I knew in one breath the whole of what she meant, and I rode after her, not in a jealousy, but because she was going to her ruin over rotten February ice in the black dark, and there was no one else to fetch her back. The team took fright and bolted for the open channel by the weir, where the ice never holds, and I caught them at the very lip of it, and turned them, and got her out and got her woman out, and the sleigh went through where we had been. And the near lamp shattered against the iron of the runner as it went, and that, the jaw, the hand, is where I got this. Not driving in a madness. Stopping her. No one was lost, Francis. That is the one clean thing in the whole of it. No one went into the water that night. It cost me a face and a hand, and it was the cheapest bargain I ever made. And then, said Francis, very low, holding the bandaged hand, because she knew he was not near the worst of it yet. And then I lied, he said. That is the wound, Francis, not the face. The face healed. She was ruined the instant it was known. A girl who had taken a man's sleigh at midnight to run off with a soldier over the ice, the county would never have let her live it down in 50 years. And I loved her, or believed I did, which at 18 is the same weight to carry. So I said I had been driving. I said it was my folly, my wildness, my fault, and that she had been an innocent, frightened passenger to a young fool's madness. It cost her a fright, and the pity of the county. It cost me only my name, which I did not then know was the whole of a man. And she let me. She stood by while I took the blame that was hers, and thanked me for it prettily, and within the year had married a baronet richer than the soldier, and kept her spotless name, and became the beautiful tragic girl who could not, poor thing, love a monster. And I became the monster, and took my mother's world down into one shut room and one green glasshouse. Because once I had made myself a liar to save her, it seemed the only honest thing left, to be in the world's eye, the low thing I had said I was. He turned his marked face full to the lamp then, and to her, and said the last of it. But that is not the whole wound, and I will give you the whole of it, since you did not flinch from the rest. The wound is not that she let me take the blame. It is what it taught me, that I have never once been able to unlearn, that a woman brought close enough to my face and my name will in the end always go, as the most beautiful woman in 3 counties went, and let me be the beast in her place, and never wrote, and never looked back. I built the whole of my life around the lesson of it, that the one safe kindness I could do myself was to want nothing, and hope for nothing, and be looked at by no one, and keep my summer behind the glass for no one, forever, because to hope otherwise was only to set the wound to bleed again. That is what you married sight unseen, Francis Wren. A liar who has told the truth exactly once in 20 years, and told it to you, because he could not bear that you should think it his own wildness that marked him, when it was only ever his own foolish faith. The door is open, you may go through it or not, and the settlement holds either way, and if you would rather live apart, in comfort, you have earned the right 10 times over. You owe me nothing. You came to save your father's flowers, and you have. The rest was never in the bargain. The lamp burned steady between them, the one flame she would let stand in that house of screened fires. And Frances Wren sat with her husband's cut and bandaged hand in her lap, and found that the low, lifelong certainty she had been raised inside, that she was the plain one, the spare one, the girl worth the price of her keep and no more, had gone strangely silent in her, as though a hand had come down on a struck string, and she lifted the bare, scarred hand, very gently, and held it in both of hers, and did not let it go. I will tell you what I owe you, Julian, and what I do not, since we are being exact, she said, and her voice did not rise. It had not risen once in the whole of this, and she did not mean to begin now. I do not owe you a marriage of pity, and I will not give you one. You were right to dread it, and you may cease dreading it, for I have none in me for you, and never had. But I will tell you the one thing I do owe you, which no settlement drew, and which I give you freely. Your face was only a face by the second morning, my dear. I cannot tell you a comfortable lie, and I will not begin with that one. And the wound you think has disfigured you past any woman's loving, the belief that a woman brought close will always, in the end, go. That is the only untrue thing in this whole room, and it is a mislabelled thing, and I am the one person bred from the cradle to spot a mislabelled thing and set it right. She did not go because your face was too much to love. She went because her heart was too small to do it, which was wrong with her, and never once with you. And you have worn her smallness 20 years, as though it were your own deformity, and it is not yours, and I am taking it off you tonight, the way I would take a wrong label off a good plant. I am not going anywhere, not ever. You kept the whole of summer alive behind that glass, for no one. Well, you have someone now, and she is not going, and there is no clause in it and no term, and it is full and final, and it cannot be reopened. Now be still, and let me see to your hand. I will not have my husband's hand lost to me in the same season I have only just found out I had a husband. Everything after was different, and nothing changed on the face of it, which is the way of the deepest changes. They did not carry the tale of that night to the county. There was a good deal that was quiet and their own to lose, and Frances came without hesitation to the place her husband had stood on alone for 20 years, that some truths are best carried and not cried, and that she was strong enough now to help him carry this one. But the marriage was no longer a marriage of purchase on either side, and both knew it. And if the tale of the beast of Wraxholm did not die all at once, such tales never do, it began, from the night of the Aucleys and the ice outward, quietly to rot at the root, the way even the oldest and best-loved lie will, once one true thing has finally been let stand up beside it, in the light. And then, at the very end of the following autumn, near a 12-month wed, her family came back. It came in the person of her Aunt Ferris, in a hired chaise, on a raw, bright November afternoon, with her best furs on, and her husband stout and silent beside her, and, which Frances had not looked for, a narrow, smiling, soft-spoken attorney named Mr. Skeen, with a leather portfolio on his knee. Augusta Ferris came up the great steps of Wraxholm with the assurance of a woman who has decided that a duchess for a niece is a property she has not yet been permitted to enjoy the full income of, and she embraced Frances in the cold hall with a warmth that had never once been there when Frances mended her linen, priced the hall furniture with one sweep of her eye, and settled herself by the library fire as one come home at last to her due. Frances received all three with unimpeachable tea, and waited, because she had learned long ago that the one who waits is the one who wins, and that a Ferris with a want in her will always, given rope enough, come at last to the naming of it. Her husband stood by the cold hearth, silent, at her asking. She had told him the night before what she meant to do, and he had argued, and she had heard him out and then said, "No, my dear." You have spent 20 years being the one who takes the blame and carries the lie, so that no one else need be troubled by the truth of themselves. It is my turn, and it is my family, and if there is one thing a plain woman who reads was seasoned for, it is the quiet undoing of people who believe her too dull to be watching. Stand by the fire, and be silent, and let me show you what your own gentleness bought this last year. And he had bowed his dark head, and obeyed her. Mr. Skeen opened, as such men open, with a full half-hour of smiling regret, the sad narrowness of the Ferris's present circumstances, the singular liberality of the Wraxholm settlement, of which the family had understood they were to partake, and had not, the natural expectation of a devoted aunt that a niece so wonderfully advanced would wish to see her benefactors made comfortable. And, more delicately, the great regret it would be if the peculiar circumstances of so singular a marriage, a bride sent north sight unseen, in such haste to a gentleman of such reputation, were ever to become a subject of common talk. "Name the figure, Mr. Skeen," said Frances pleasantly. "You have been half an hour not naming it, and the tea is going cold, and my husband, who is silent by that fire out of courtesy to my wish, and not from any want of things he could say, has a hand that pains him when he sits too long in a cold room, so I would take it kindly if you would come to the sum." Mr. Skeen put off his stroke, named the figure, an annuity to Mrs. Ferris, secured upon Wraxholm, the discharge of certain of Mr. Ferris's obligations, a suitable acknowledgment of the family's natural feelings. "Their natural feelings," said Frances. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Skeen. That is admirably clear, and I will now be equally clear, and then there will be an end, and you shall all be back in the chaise before the good horses take a chill." She set down her cup. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised it once in the whole of this history. "Your case, stripped of the flowers, is this, that my marriage was a strange one and a hasty one, and might be made to sound stranger. That my husband is a man the county tells ugly stories of, and that he will pay a great deal, and go on paying, rather than have his wife's aunt carry those stories to the newspapers. That is the whole of the true offer under your regrets, aunt, and we may as well have it bare on the table. Have I the shape of it? Her aunt had the grace, at least, to color. You put it very coarsely, Frances. After all, I put it exactly, aunt, which you have always mistaken for coarseness, because you have never once had to look plainly at what you were doing while you did it. Now attend, for I am going to save us a very tedious afternoon." Mr. Cardot, the Duke's dry solicitor, who had been sitting unregarded in the window seat with a locked box at his feet, for Frances had written to him the moment her aunt's letter came, and he had come north with the box the day before the chaise, rose and inclined his head. "The first document, if you please." Cardew laid it on the table, turned to face the visitors. "Her Grace's marriage articles," he said, dry as a law calf's binding. "I will trouble the company to attend to 2 clauses, both required by her Grace herself before she would sign, a year ago, in your own drawing-room, madam, while you assured her she need not trouble to read them. The first settles her whole maintenance to her sole and separate use, beyond the reach, the words are here, and exact, of any creditor of any Ferris, living or unborn. There is, in short, no annuity to be had here, and no obligation to discharge, because there is not, in law, 1 shilling of this settlement that her Grace could give you if she wished, which, you will have gathered, she does not. The second protects, in perpetuity, a certain collection of plants and books, the property of the late Mr. Thomas Wren, against any claim whatsoever. That is the whole of what the Ferris family contracted for out of this marriage, and her Grace saw to it a year ago, with her own eyes, that it was the whole of what you would ever get. There is nothing here to reopen. She closed it before she came. The library was very quiet. Mr. Skeen read the 2 clauses, and his smile did not so much fall as quietly cease to be renewed. Mr. Ferris looked at his boots, and Augusta Ferris's assurance began the maneuver her niece knew of old, the slow shift from injured affection into injured innocence. "An old paper and a clever girl," she said, rallying. "You were always sly, Francis, always watching, always reading what was never meant for you. But there is more than papers in this world. There is talk. There is what a family may let be known, out of pure grief at being so used, about a marriage no honest woman would have made, sold off in a week to a man with a face like that, a man who, there it is. The talk." Francis rose, unhurried, crossed to the locked box at Cardew's feet, and took from it herself a small flat packet, tied and sealed, the paper gone soft and brown at the folds with age. "I wondered when we should come to the talk, Aunt, for it is the only coin left in your purse now. The settlement has spent the rest." "You mean you will carry it all through the county and the papers until my husband pays you to be quiet. So let me show you the last document, and then we shall have done." She came back and set the little sealed packet on the tea-table between herself and her aunt, and rested her hand flat upon it and did not open it. "I will not read these to you," she said, very gently. "I will only tell you what they are, and let you decide how much appetite you truly have for carrying the ugly stories of Wraxholm into open daylight. These are letters, 20 years old, in a lady's hand, a very great lady of this county, whom you would both be enchanted to be received by, and never will be now. They were written the winter of the accident everyone here has heard the county's version of, and kept, all these years, sealed, by the one man honorable enough never to use them. And they tell, in that lady's own hand, whose folly took the sleigh onto the ice, and who was fetched back from her own ruin, and who chose afterward to let an innocent man wear the blame and the ugly name for 20 years so her own might stay spotless. My husband would keep them sealed to his grave. But I am not so good as my husband, Aunt, and I will make you the offer he never would. The moment one word of my marriage, or my husband, or this house appears in any paper or drawing-room by your doing, these letters cease to be sealed, and the county that has whispered about the beast for 20 years learns instead the true winter's tale of the beauty, and every door in 3 shires shuts to you forever. Or you go home this afternoon, and you are quiet, and the letters stay sealed, and everyone's name in this room stays as whole as it is this minute, yours included, which is a mercy you have done nothing to earn, and are getting only because I would rather finish my husband's kindness than spend it. You have until the tea is cold to choose, and I find I no longer greatly mind which you decide, which is the freest I have felt in the whole of my life." Augusta Ferris looked at her plain niece across the tea-table, really looked, perhaps for the first time in the 23 years she had been overlooking her, and what looked steadily back at her was not for sale, had never been for sale, had in fact a year before, while she pronounced the girl too dull to read a settlement, been quietly reading the whole of the future, and closing every door in it against exactly this afternoon. She looked at the sealed packet under her niece's steady hand. She looked, last and longest, at the tall, scarred, silent man by the cold hearth who had kept a wronging woman's letters, sealed 20 years, rather than clear his own good name, and who stood now watching his wife with an expression Augusta Ferris had certainly never once seen turned upon herself in the whole of her comfortable life, and something moved in the aunt's handsome, greedy features, some old buried thing, which was, for one unguarded moment, "Shame. Come, Mr. Ferris," she said, rising rather too quickly, not meeting anyone's eye. "We have troubled her grace long enough. Put away your portfolio, Mr. Skeen. There is nothing here for us. Nothing at all. And the three of them went out through the cold hall and down the great steps to the chaise, without the annuity and without 1 shilling of the ducal gold she had come 140 miles to squeeze, and the whole grasping business ended, as her niece had meant it to. Not in a scandal, but in a silence, the sealed packet going back into the box, unopened, into the dark, where it would stay. It was only at the door, while Mr. Skeen got the defeated portfolio into the chaise, that the aunt turned back once to her niece, the plain one, the spare one, the drudge she had married off in a week to be rid of, standing now Duchess of Wraxholm in the door of the warmest great house in the north, with the scarred master of it at her shoulder, as no man had ever once stood at Augusta Ferris's, and said, "Lo, and for the only time in her life wholly without performance, you always did read the things the rest of us threw out, Francis, your father's dull books, the labels on his weeds, the papers no one meant you to see. We thought it a want in you." Her eyes went once round the warm hall, the man, the marriage, the whole undreamt of life. It was never because you had nothing better to look at. Was it? "No," said Francis, not unkindly. "It was never because I had nothing better." "Goodbye, aunt. Go home, and be as well as you can, and be quiet, and you will keep your name, which is more than you came here meaning to leave me with. That is the whole of what I have to give you, and it is a great deal more than you would ever have given me." And it was then, and only then, in the whole of that long grey afternoon, that the Duke of Wraxholm spoke, from the doorway of his own house, in the low rough carrying voice that had once cried a drowning couple's names across the black water of the mere Mrs. Ferris. The aunt stopped on the steps, and turned. "You married her off in a week, sight unseen, to a man you believed a monster, to be rid of the trouble of her keep, and she has spent this afternoon saving your name from the fire your own greed lit under it, which is a mercy I could not have found in myself. So I will say the thanks she is too clear-eyed to say, and you are too small to understand, and then you will go. Thank you, Mrs. Ferris, for the one wholly good thing you ever did, which you did by accident, greedily. To be rid of a girl you thought worth nothing, you sent me my wife. Now get down the steps of this house, and do not come up them again. Good day." The chaise rolled. The long climbing road took it, and the lodge and the fell, and Frances stood in the door of Wraxholm, in the raw bright light, and felt her husband come to stand close at her shoulder, his bare scarred hand coming to rest, unhidden, over hers on the cold stone of the balustrade, and found that what she felt, watching her family go, was neither triumph nor grief, but the plain, clean sensation of a very long sum at last, worked through and proved and ruled off, and under it, rising, quiet and enormous, the whole warm rest of her life. Lady Rossiter came to Wraxholm that Christmas, Celestine that had been, who had let him take her blame and worn the name of the tragic jilted girl ever since. She came angling the invitation through a cousin of a cousin, widowed and no longer rich in beginning, at 37 to be afraid, for a whisper had reached even her that the beast of Wraxholm had taken a wife who did not seem to find him a beast at all, and that the old safe story, on which her whole spotless character rested, might not be so safely sealed as it had been these 20 years. And the Duke met her in his warm bright hall, with his marked face open and easy, the scarred hand ungloved at his side, and bowed over her hand with a flawless, weightless courtesy, and said, "Lady Rossiter, you are very welcome. May I present my wife?" and turned to Frances with his whole grave face gone warm, and that was all. And Celestine understood, in the time it takes to rise out of a curtsy, that she had been these 20 years, not hated and not mourned, and not so much as thought of, merely, quietly, long ago, recovered from. She made her civil goodbyes, and went south. and was never after heard by any servant of that house to speak the name of Wraxholm again. Frances took her father's whole collection up out of the coach-house that first spring, pot by pot and book by book, and gave it a home. For she had the old orangery at the far end of the glasshouse, cleared and glazed anew. And there she ranged the salvaged plants of Thomas Wren's whole quiet, unrewarded life, and shelved his books and hung where the morning light came first through the glass. His worn leather notebook open on a stand, the notebook she had carried north in her lap to a monster's house, in the days when she had thought it the only thing left in the world that was hers. And her husband worked beside her at it, day on day, and one morning, come on the great old camellia against the south wall, with its soft brown label in her father's hand, she took a fresh cutting of it with her own knife, and struck it, and potted it, and set it on the very table in the south front where its parent had stood in flower the first cold night she came. So that the flower that had welcomed the sight unseen bride into the coldest house in England was her own father's flower, come home to the daughter who saved it, blooming in the warm. In the spring after that, when the news was out that the beast's garden was no tomb, but the wonder of the north, they threw the winter garden open. It was Frances's doing, over his first flinching and then his slow glad help, for she had said, one evening among the camellias, "You have kept the whole of summer alive behind this glass, for 20 years, my dear, for no one, because you were told a garden no one is let to see is a garden that cannot be found wanting. Well, I have been found wanting my whole life by people not fit to judge a weed. And I have come out the far side into the sun, and so shall this garden. The whole valley shall come up and walk through your mother's summer in the middle of their own hard year, and the story of the beast will die the only death a story truly dies, which is that the people who told it walk in at the door and see with their own eyes it was never true. And so they did. On a bright, hard afternoon at the tail of that winter, the whole valley came up the long road to Wraxholm, the Auchleys at the head of them, who owed the Duke their lives, and behind them the village and the tenants, and the curious and the ashamed, and walked, 2 by 2, out of their own grey February, and into the green, warm, blazing summer of the winter garden. And there was not a soul in that wondering crowd, raised on the tail of the cold master of Wraxholm and his garden of the dead, who did not stand in the sweet warm green of it and feel the old story turn, in the standing, into something else, the cruel cold thing they had believed for 20 years, quietly giving up the ghost in the one place it could never survive, which was the truth. He laid the glove by that spring and did not take it up again. He had worn it 20 years to spare the world the sight of his hand, and himself the sight of the world's flinching. But there was no one left at Wraxholm to flinch, and by degrees no one in the valley either, and a man may go bare-handed through a country that has stopped being afraid of him. Frances saw the glove one morning lying forgotten on the glasshouse bench where he had put it down to take a cutting, and never afterwards saw it on his hand, and if the old habit still came on him sometimes, in a strange company or a hard mood, to turn the marked cheek from the light, or draw the scarred hand back, it came less and less, because her own hand was over his now, bare to bare. On every threshold of his life, and a man can bear the eyes of the whole world upon his worst marked hand, it turns out, if only there is one hand laid warm over his while they look. They skated the mere the second winter. It froze hard and clean and true that year, and the whole estate went out onto it for the sport, as the country people had done for 100 years before the bad story ever attached to the water, and Frances laced her skates on the near bank, at the very place she had once been forbidden to walk, and put out her mittened hand, and said, "Come, it is only ice, Julian," sounded and safe. And there is a whole valley out on it laughing, and I have a mind to see the beast of Wraxholm laugh in front of the lot of them, on the very water they have feared on his account for 20 years, until not one of them can tell the cold story with a straight face again. And he came, stiff at first and then not stiff, out onto the black and silver ice under the winter sun, with his bare, scarred hand fast in hers, and they skated the length of the mere together, badly, laughing, in the middle of a whole valley of their own people out on the ice in the sun. The very water that had taken his face and his name and 20 years of his life turned, in one bright afternoon, into the place the county saw its master laugh, and there was not a man on the mere that day who did not carry home instead the picture of the two of them going down the ice, hand in hand, in the sun, which is the story that got told to the children, until the other wore quite away. The years came, and did to a happiness built on rock what the years always do, made it larger and quieter and far more amused. The shrouded rooms opened one by one. The light came back into the long front. The mere was kept sounded and safe, and the great glass house opened to the valley every year at the turning of the winter, so that the coming up to Wraxholm to walk in the Duke's summer became a thing the whole country did, and could no longer rightly remember ever having dreaded. Her father's rescued collection throve and spread. Cuttings of the winter camellias went down into the valley by Francis's hand, until half the cottage windows in the parish had a scrap of Thomas Wren's green summer flowering on the sill in January, and the plainest, coldest houses in the north kept, each one, a little living red flame of it against the frost. The county came round, as the county always comes round, a good 10 years behind its own gardeners, until the children of the valley grew up knowing Wraxholm only as the great warm house at the head of the mere where the summer lived under glass. The sealed packet of Celestine's letters stayed in its dark box to the end of both their lives, and passed it, unopened. And no one in 3 shires ever learned what it had cost the master of Wraxholm to keep it sealed, nor what his wife had spared with it. The county had called it the coldest house in the north, and behind the glass the summer had never once gone out. The worn leather notebook stayed open on its stand in the morning light to the end of Francis's days, and the little cutting she had carried north in flannel against her ankle grew, in the warm, into a great old camellia of its own, tall against the glass, that flowered every year in the deepest cold, when everything outside had given up, the thrown-away thing and the kept thing at last in one warm room together. The daughter valued at the price of her keep, and the father's work reckoned so much. Lumber, both come home, both found, both warm. And there was not a soul in that once cold house who did not come at last to hold what the county itself came round to holding, a decade too late as usual, that the plain Wren girl, the spare one, the poor relation married off, in a week to be rid of, had made the great marriage of her generation, and that it was she, stooping as she had always stooped for the discarded and mislabelled thing, who had walked in at last, past every warning she had been raised on, through the door of the one house in England where a man had kept the whole of summer burning behind the glass for 20 winters, alone, waiting without hope for someone who would look at his marked face and not turn away. She had gone to Wraxholm to save her father's flowers and to keep a bargain, and had found that the warmth she was told did not exist in that house had been there the whole time, kept alive by the very man they had sent her north to fear. The county had called it the coldest house in the north, and behind the glass, for them and for the whole valley after them, the summer had never once, from that first red flower on a stranger's table to the very last, gone out. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.